conference of the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Myanmar, Mr. Thomas Andrews. Mr. Andrews is the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Myanmar. He is a former member of the US Congress from Maine and a human rights fellow at Yale Law School. He has worked for many years in diverse capacities on the situation of human rights in Myanmar. Special rapporteurs are part of what is known as the Special Procedures of the Human Rights Council. He is an independent expert appointed by the Human Rights Council in Geneva. Over to you, Mr. Special Rapporteur.
Thank you very much, Jackie, and good afternoon, everyone. Is everybody set? Okay. Thank you very much for being here this afternoon, and I want to thank the government of Malaysia for welcoming me here to your country. I am, as you've heard, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Myanmar, and I am honored to be here in Malaysia. I came to Malaysia last week at the invitation of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and I am extremely grateful to the Ministry and to all of those who have contributed to making my visit both informative and meaningful. Malaysia is the first ASEAN member state to welcome me. This will be the first of what I am planning to be a series of meetings and visits to the region so that I have a greater understanding of the perspectives and insights of those who have a great deal at stake in developments in Myanmar. The primary objective of my mission was to gather information on the situation of human rights in Myanmar and better understand both the Malaysian and ASEAN responses to this crisis. Throughout the week, I've met a number of Malaysian government officials. I've met with members of parliament, civil society leaders, and individuals from diverse Myanmar communities who have fled the military's violence and persecution. This crisis, triggered by a brutal military coup, has meant disaster for the people of Myanmar. Since the February 2021 military coup, the junta has carried out a campaign of violence, oppression, and terror against the people of Myanmar. Junta forces have killed more than 2,000 civilians, arrested more than 14,000, displaced more than 700,000, driving the number of internally displaced persons in Myanmar to well over 1 million, and plunged the country into an economic and humanitarian crisis that threatens the lives and well-being of millions. The military's attack on the people of Myanmar constitute crimes against humanity and war crimes. No one has been spared the impact of the military's violence. I recently published a report on how children are being impacted by the junta's violent attempt at subjugating the people of Myanmar. Armed groups have killed or injured at least 382 children since the coup, and the military and its allies are responsible for the vast majority of these deaths and injuries. Since launching the coup, junta forces have arbitrarily detained more than 1,400 children, and they have tortured at least 142 Myanmar children. Children have been beaten, they've been cut, they've been stabbed, they've been burned with cigarettes, they've been forced to hold stress positions, they have been subjected to mock executions. These children have been sexually assaulted. Some have had their fingernails and their hair pulled out. At least 61 children are currently being held hostage by the junta. It is projected now that an estimated 33,000 children will die preventable deaths this year alone in Myanmar, simply because they have not received routine immunizations. We knew prior to the coup what the military of Myanmar and its commanders were capable of. The genocidal attacks against the Rohingya Muslim minority were directed by the man who led the military coup and now directs the military junta that is committing atrocities throughout Myanmar, Senior General Min Aung Hlaing. I commend Malaysia for opening its doors to many of the Rohingya survivors who were fleeing those attacks, desperate to find a safe haven. Malaysia has a long history of taking in those fleeing persecution around the world. I have learned that there are over 104,000 Rohingya who are registered in Malaysia, with untold numbers who are unregistered. I have met some of them on this trip to Malaysia. My mission has provided me with a unique opportunity to sit face to face with dozens of the courageous men and women and children who fled the horrors that have engulfed areas throughout Myanmar, including those who have recently arrived here in Malaysia. They provided me with a first-hand account of what they witnessed or what they directly experienced. These stories, without exception, emphasized the terror that is raging now across Myanmar. I am very grateful to the Shan, the Kachin, the Rohingya, the Chin, Rakhine, and Burman refugees with whom I have met. I spoke with refugees who have been here for years and some who have been here for just weeks. What they have in common is that they have fled Myanmar for the very reasons that make people refugees, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. Nearly all face threats of death or detention if they were to return to Myanmar. Under no circumstances should anyone who has fled Myanmar be refouled back to Myanmar. I have spoken with defectors from the Myanmar police, the Myanmar Army, the Myanmar Navy, who have witnessed their colleagues murder protesters and indiscriminately fire on Myanmar villages. I have spoken with young people who witnessed their fellow protesters being shot and killed by junta forces. I have spoken with protesters, including numerous members of the civil disobedience movement, who were detained by junta forces. Many of these courageous individuals describe being arrested and tortured, including being brutally beaten, subject to stressed positions, and starved of food. One man was hit in the head so hard that he has now lost the use of one eye. I spoke to a man who personally saw people who had been brutally beaten and killed while in detention. I heard from women and girls who were arrested and detained. One of them had her hair forcibly cut in humiliation. Others were beaten and subjected to sexual threats. As I've repeated in my reports, the situation in Myanmar is a human rights catastrophe. People who are fleeing Myanmar are desperately seeking to escape attacks, persecution, and torture. They are desperate to save their lives and the lives of their family. They are refugees in the true sense of the word, seeking safety beyond their own borders for an uncertain future, including in Malaysia. They are literally running for their lives. Those who fled Myanmar told me of the harrowing trips and conditions they braved to come here. They put their lives in the hands of so-called agents and crossed the Myanmar-Thai border by foot through the jungle, crossing rivers. They went days without food and water, making their way to the Thai-Malaysia border, where they had to cross yet another jungle on foot. One woman told me how she trekked through the jungle all night long in total darkness, holding the hand of the person in front of her, unable to speak. Those that lost their way were abandoned in the jungle without food. Women carried their children for days on end. Another woman explained how she was forced to leave her younger children behind with relatives for fear that they would not be able to survive the journey. I spoke with another who brought her elderly parents with her all the way to the Thai-Malaysia border, only to have the agent demand that she leave her parents behind in the jungle to fend for themselves while they continued on. A brave young woman told me, "You are walking on a path that you don't know, towards a place you don't know, and you could die on the way, but you still go forward because the persecution that is behind you is worse." What is clear to me is the extreme vulnerability of refugees in Malaysia. Fleeing violence and conflict back home, they carry with them deep trauma, arriving with often no more than the clothes on their back and the deep desire for a safer life for them and their children. It is this very vulnerability that exposes them to further abuses. Without identity documentation, they fear approaching Malaysian authorities for help if they are victims of crime or violence or are subject to exploitation. This includes refugee women victims of domestic violence who may feel reluctant to report their cases. I received reports from many with whom I spoke of being targeted by unscrupulous police officers who extorted them for the little that they have. Many fear walking on the streets. There is also a palpable fear by everyone from Myanmar with whom I spoke of being sent to a migration detention center. On this point, I am limited on what I can say because I did not have access to Malaysian detention facilities. And I am not the only one. Since 2019, UNHCR has been denied access to these facilities. Families of those detained have no access to their relatives. I spoke to a refugee whose brother has been detained for 6 months. She does not know his condition, nor when or even if he will be released. I was told that Rohingya refugees in detention are vulnerable of being detained indefinitely precisely because they are stateless. And I am deeply concerned by reports that hundreds of children may be in these facilities, including child victims of trafficking. Children should never be placed in migration detention facilities. Education was another concern that was consistently raised during my trip here. I had the pleasure on World Refugees Day of participating in a roundtable discussion on refugee education. I learned from current and former Malaysian government officials as well as international organizations that undocumented children are unable to attend public schools in Malaysia. Instead, they receive their primary education largely through community-based learning centers. Secondary education is out of the reach for most, if not all. I asked a 13-year-old girl what she wanted to be when she grew up, without hesitation. She smiled and she told me that she wanted to be a teacher. I was later told that the girl had not yet been informed that she would soon reach the end of her education in Malaysia. University education is not accessible at all. Lack of education not only leads to hopelessness about the future, but also leads children and their families into cycles of further marginalization and negative coping mechanisms. Community-based organizations are trying to fill this void with committed volunteers, many who are refugees themselves, working with only meager resources. Many have developed a system of community-based alternative learning centers. So long as public education remains unavailable to undocumented Myanmar children, the international community must step up to help fund these organizations who are providing these essential services for Myanmar children. Let me be clear. Refugees from Myanmar are here precisely because they were forced to be here. Their inability to return to their homes in Myanmar is directly linked to the military junta's human rights violations and their war against the people of Myanmar. It is impossible to address issues relating to those seeking refuge in Malaysia or other nations without directly and effectively addressing the crisis inside Myanmar. The solution to this is not here, it is in Myanmar. Malaysia not only recognizes this fact, it has been willing through the words and actions of your foreign minister to challenge ASEAN to examine their current policy on Myanmar. Foreign Minister Saifuddin has called on ASEAN to move from a policy of non-interference to, in his words, one of non-indifference. We are all familiar with ASEAN's 5-point consensus. Malaysia has given voice to the obvious fact that after more than 1 year, nothing has moved, and since nothing has moved, more people are being killed and more people are being forced to flee the country. Foreign Minister Saifuddin has implored his ASEAN colleagues to not wait for yet another year of inaction, to not just talk about the 5-point consensus, but create and engage an action plan to move forward, an action plan with a time frame for implementation. Malaysia has not only called for ASEAN to engage with the Myanmar National Unity Government, it has begun engaging with the National Unity Government's Foreign Minister, Zin Ma-ung. Too much is at stake for Myanmar and its people to accept complacency and inaction by the international community. This is why the leadership being exhibited by Malaysia is so critically important, and why I am particularly pleased to have the opportunity to travel here. I am, again, very grateful for the opportunity to visit Malaysia. I look forward to working to support Malaysia's foreign policy leadership on Myanmar, to affirm the human rights of a people under siege, and to reduce the incredible scale of human suffering in Myanmar. Thank you very much, and I'd be happy to at least try to answer your questions. And if I covered it all, that's great. Oh, no. Yes.
Justin from the Star newspaper here. Sir, have you had any contact with the Malaysian Home Ministry with regards to the Rohingya detainees?
No, sir. I've had, we've sought meetings with the Home Ministry, but we were not able to get a meeting with the Home Ministry.
Lately, there have been a lot of action against, especially the Rohingyans, people here by the Immigration Department. Any thoughts on that? Because they are running them up.
Who's running amok?
The Immigration Department.
Well, that's an interesting choice of words. What I would say is this, and I explain this in my statement. The people who I met here, and I met many, and I talked to many in community centers who are serving people who have come here running for their lives from Myanmar. They are vulnerable, and they have been exploited. And I have found too many examples from these refugees who told me stories of them, for example, being shaken down by unscrupulous police officers, taking up everything and all the money that they had. One actually beaten by a military officer. And then, of course, we have stories about what lies behind those walls in detention centers. And so it seems to me that it is important to re-examine any policy or any practice that exacerbates the great human suffering and preys upon the great vulnerability of Myanmar people who are here in Malaysia. Again, not because anything that they have done, or not because that they have a choice, but because they've been forced to run for their lives with their families. And so I would encourage a re-examination of all policies and practices that would make it even more traumatic for those who have come here for safety. Yes, ma'am.
Hi. My name is Rosanna from Reuters.
Oh, that one works apparently.
Hi, Rosanna here from Reuters. Mr. Andrews, do you have any, you spoke about ASEAN's role in this crisis. Do you have any suggestions for how ASEAN should act in their responses to Myanmar? And also, I think yesterday it was reported that Aung San Suu Kyi's court cases have been moved to the prison. So I was wondering if you had any information of whether she's been moved there permanently, or any thoughts on that. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I have no information on that, and unfortunately we have very, very little information about her whereabouts and what is happening with her, except that clearly there is a gross miscarriage of justice going on in the country. And any suggestion that there could be any possibility of a free and fair election in Myanmar in 2023 is frankly preposterous. You can't have a free and fair election if you've locked up your opponents. You can't have a free and fair election if you've put your opponents on death row. This is an outrage. And any pretense or suggestion that a free and fair election is possible should be rejected firmly by ASEAN and everyone else. The junta works very hard to try to create an impression of legitimacy. Their propaganda machine works round the clock, and they'll take any thread of evidence that they could find to make it appear as if the international community recognizes them as legitimate. That is something that we need to be very cautious of, very careful of, and not fall into that propaganda trap, including any suggestion that this election could in any way be free or fair. So that's really important. And I'm very sorry, I forgot the first part of your question.
How should ASEAN respond?
Well, I just gave you one example of what they should do is bring the pressure to bear to release any and all political prisoners. Pressure, any and all pressure, for the juntas to stop the violence. Make it very clear that what's happening in Myanmar is not only unsustainable and horrific for the people of Myanmar, but it has a direct impact on the people of ASEAN and this region. Everyone suffers as a result of this. And so it is in the interests of all of ASEAN to do the right thing with respect to the horrors being inflicted upon the Myanmar people, particularly its children, but it's also in the interests of all living in ASEAN countries for them to do so. So I would bring whatever pressure that can be brought to bear to work in cooperation with countries around the world who are working to exert economic pressure, political pressure, diplomatic pressure on the junta. What's really important for us to understand is that the future of Myanmar is in the hands of the Myanmar people. And I've been so impressed with the young people in particular who are at the front lines of this opposition movement in Myanmar. They have no intention of going backward. They've had a taste of freedom. They've been connected to the world. And so they are leading the way for their country. But in order for them to be successful, they need support from those of us in the international community who are in a position to provide that support. And as long as I am the special rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Myanmar, I'm going to do everything possible to provide that support, and I encourage everyone, all countries in ASEAN, to follow the lead of Malaysia's foreign minister in providing the kind of pressure and recognition that more simply must be done. The 5-point consensus is meaningless if it sits on a piece of paper. Its only chance of making a difference is if it's put into meaningful action with a strategy, with an action plan, and with a time frame precisely as the foreign minister has called for.
Hi, I'm Rose from Panama.
Oh yes, hi. Hello.
So my question is about the Myanmar task force that has been set up last month to coordinate and deliver humanitarian aid to the country with the involvement of the ASEAN AHA Center. So how do you see the progress of the task force so far?
I think it is very, very important for us to understand, much as I talked about the junta using any thread of appearance of legitimacy to create the propaganda of legitimacy, it's really important that humanitarian aid be humanitarian aid. And that means not being allowed to be used as a weapon of war by the military junta. And as long as you have the military junta being in a position to be able to direct where and how so-called humanitarian aid is going to be delivered, make no mistake, they're going to use it to advance their political and military objectives. And that is not in the interest of the people in Myanmar. I would strongly encourage that those who are engaged in the vitally important part of humanitarian aid to reach out to the national unity government, to reach out to those organizations and networks that are on the border, ask them how we can get that humanitarian aid in. I would also suggest that the international community end the scandalous neglect of the fund that has been established for humanitarian aid for the people of Myanmar. Just a little over 10%, 10.4% of that fund has been filled by the international community for this year, and we are already more than halfway through the year. 10%. That is scandalous. That is an outrage. And so I think we should all be calling for the international community to step up, not just with words, but with action, and that's one of the meaningful ways that they could step up with action. And I just want to say, just to go back and say, I said that I made reference to someone who was beaten, who told me that they had been beaten. I mistakenly said by a military officer. It was a police officer. I was saying how some of the refugees are being shaken down. Many are being shaken down on the streets. This person was beaten by a police officer. So I want to just correct that for the record. Anyone else? Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Ms. Lisa from Benar News here. There's two questions. One is that in April, Malaysian government has said that they are planning to issue their own refugee card. What is your thought about that?
I'm sorry. Who is? Who is issuing a card?
Malaysian government.
The Malaysian government.
The Home Minister himself has said this. To issue own refugee card for those who come to Malaysia as refugee. So basically, they say that they have to have the authority to determine who has to stay, who can stay. Okay, second question.
Okay, well, let me just answer that. First of all, I think there has to be a lot more transparency here. That there needs to be a willingness to engage in discussions about policy, about how refugees are being treated, about policies and practices. I was unable to get a meeting with the Home Ministry, for example. And I think what's important is that there be steps taken that can actually make progress toward justice and dignity for these very, very desperate people. So working in concert with UNHCR, for example, and making sure that these policies are clear and consistent and linked together and coordinated and transparent and accountable, I think is really, really an important step. But there are many, many steps I think that we need to take for that to be realized.
So, do you agree with what he said, or you think that the UNHCR still has the power to issue refugee card?
No, I think that several steps have to be taken now before any such steps were to take place. In other words, I think there's some fundamentals that I pointed out that do not exist now that should exist now in terms of my recommendation of how refugees are treated. Obviously, this is a Malaysian government decision, and I respect that. But I also believe it important that there be a level of transparency and openness and willingness to partner with those who very sincerely want the best for those who are here for no fault of their own or for any other reason by the fact that they just have to be here. And I think it's important that there be confidence building and also practical steps that can bring some assurance that we're moving in the right direction with respect to these people, and that this be part of a process that begins just as soon as humanly possible. I mean, I wish, frankly, it's hard for me to answer your question because I haven't had a chance to talk to them about this proposed policy and how it would work and whether it would be how it would be coordinated and whether it would be transparent. I'm just guessing because I don't know. But that's the point. That's the point. It's important to know. And so that would be my recommendation.
Okay, the second question is, Radio Free Asia published a special report recently about the documented atrocities committed by soldiers during military operation in Myanmar's town Sagaing region.
Sagaing, yes.
Okay, there were quite a number of photos, there were videos as well, recording soldiers bragging about their killings and how they killed these people. Are you guys going to investigate this?
Yes. Yes. We're looking at any and all evidence of these atrocities. And I know others within the UN community are doing so as well. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, sir, I'm Eileen from the Associated Press.
Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to find out, what do you think, what sort of role can the National Unity Government really play? Do you think that government should perhaps give them official diplomatic recognition? Can you just share your view?
Well, let's be clear. Who's legitimate here and who's illegitimate? The National Unity Government is made up of people who were elected by the people of Myanmar, and also people who represent ethnic communities that are critically important to the fabric and to the future of Myanmar. And I highly recommend, and I'm glad that the foreign minister here has been engaging with the National Unity Government, with the foreign minister, and I'm recommending that all countries in the United Nations member states do the same. Now, I understand that everybody has their standards and policies and requirements for official recognition. I respect that. Every country has to make that determination. But there's lots that can be done right now from a very practical point of view by engaging in this legitimate entity that speaks to the aspirations of the people of Myanmar against a brutal military that is crushing the hopes and dreams of the Myanmar people and taking their lives. So I think it is very important for many reasons, but from a practical point of view, we just talked about humanitarian aid. There's lots of information that they have available that can be of extremely valuable use for these countries seeking to get humanitarian aid. So I very much encourage countries to do everything that they can to engage with the National Unity Government, recognition if they can, engagement on an informal basis if they can, but to tap this resource that we have available to us as an international community toward not only understanding the perspective of the people of Myanmar and the aspirations of the people of Myanmar, but very practically how to help the people of Myanmar.
Sorry, going
Please.
back to the ASEAN 5-point consensus, it's going nowhere after more than a year. Do you think it's time for ASEAN perhaps to abandon the effort and consider other approaches?
Well, I think that we have to start by asking the fundamental question, why has there been no progress on the 5-point consensus? And secondly, recognize, as the foreign minister has publicly recognized, the longer we wait, the longer we delay, the longer that there is inaction, the more people that are going to die and the greater the suffering will be involved. So there's a great imperative to move that or whatever plan forward. Now, if we can have agreement among the ASEAN member states, that's a very important start. But it's only a start. And as the foreign minister has said, after 1 year, as you've just noted, after 1 year of a lack of progress at all, let's rethink this approach by adding a strategy to the implementation of that approach, and have that strategy forge an action plan that has very specific steps with very specific timeframes for their achievement. And then let's begin to engage that action plan. And so I think that's a very welcome call by the foreign minister of Malaysia. And I am hoping very, very much that ASEAN member states heeds that call. Anyone else? Okay, well listen, I really appreciate your willingness to come by and meet with me, and my door is open, so you can reach me through the United Nations special procedures. Just check on the website. By the way, I referred to the report on children. That report is available on the website. We released that last week. There's also a report, these are special reports that are in addition to my regular reports, on the proliferation of weapons to the junta and the role that member states of the United Nations is playing on the proliferation of weapons. That's also available. And then there'll be additional special reports coming up as we move forward. And let me just say, I'm looking forward very much to coming back to Malaysia. I love Malaysia. The only problem I have with Malaysia, to be perfectly honest with you, is the food here. I like it too much. And I'm afraid that my plane's not going to get off the ground when I go home, or I'm going to be, anyway. But I'm hoping that this is the first of many visits to the region, and that I will see you all again soon. Thanks so much.
Thank you. So thanks everyone for attending, and good afternoon.
We wanted to hear good day.
Good day. Or Swiss. Just like stare. Literally.
All right. So.